Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's so good to be back with you and engaging with you all again. I apologize for the delay. It's been probably about a month, maybe a month and a half since I posted my last video. It's because I became an uncle, which I'm very happy about, and had an opportunity to go out to California to visit my sister, which was wonderful. So I got to meet my nephew and help her recuperate as she was recovering from the pregnancy. So it turned out to be a wonderful month. But it meant that I was not as present on YouTube as I had been in the past. The other thing that was a big development, which I wanted to talk about today, is that I've made the transition from the Nikon D850 to the Canon R5 mirrorless system. And I don't want this to be a dramatic, clickbaity, YouTube video about matte switches from Nikon to Canon and, oh, the world's gonna change. I don't think it matters. I just want to be clear based on some of the feedback that I got in my last video. I don't think that your kit or your technology is what defined you as a photographer. There's no question about it that we are all still the minds behind the photos and the artistic perspective that we bring to our photography, or the wildlife perspective or the nature expertise and knowledge that we bring. There's no question about that. The brains are still here, they're not the camera. But I do think the tools that we shoot with help us execute on that vision and on our perspectives a little bit more easily sometimes. And that's really my experience with this transition from the D850 to the R5, from the Nikon to the Canon system, is I'm finding that it's a little bit easier to execute on the vision that I want to have behind my photos, whether that's executing on a wildlife shoot, like shooting a hawk or an owl, or whether that's landscape photography or videography, like a basic vlog like what I'm doing now. It's just a little bit easier with the R5. For today's video, I thought I'd just give you a month and a half perspective, my first impressions of what it's like to transition from the D850 to the R5 in my experience. So with that, let's hop into it and I'll walk through some of the things that I've taken away from the experience. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is autofocus. Now, I mean, this is the big gripe that I had with Nikon in the first place, was that they weren't pushing some of these advancements in the Z9 out to their other mirrorless systems, because I wanted to buy basically a mirrorless system that had advanced autofocus technology, but wasn't able to really stick with the Nikon situation. Now, there was a lot of engagement on my last video, and there's a lot of comments there about whether or not Nikon is going to push it all out to their new systems, whether they could even push it out to, say, the Z6 II or the Z7 II. And that, let's just table that for a little bit. Regardless of the situation, right now, if I wanted to stay with Nikon, I had to buy a Z9. I wasn't willing to spend that kind of money, and I didn't need that kind of camera. And I didn't want to wait another year probably until I could get my hands on another camera. So I decided, for better or for worse, to switch over to the R5. Now, with the R5, I found two things relating to the autofocus that have been exceptional in comparison to the D850. The first thing is eye autofocus. Now, whatever, if you don't think you need eye autofocus, fine, go take photos without it. It's fine. I don't care. But for me personally, switching over to something with eye autofocus has been pretty transformative. Doing something basic now, like filming myself, I see the little box around my eye. I know with reliability that my eye is going to be in shape and I'm going to be able to take this video and it's going to be in focus for you. But more to the point, when I'm out in the field and I'm shooting wildlife, I'm out there walking around for 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, maybe more, waiting for a bird. I might be tracking an owl, trying to find it in the right position. I mean, you might find the owl, but it might not have the right background, and you might not have the differentiation of subject. So you have to wait even more for the owl to move. And then you want it to wake up so you get its eyes. I mean, there's so much waiting and so much energy is invested in field craft and trying to find these subjects, that when you find the subject, the last thing you want is to miss the shot because you didn't focus on the eye. Maybe the bird was in flight and you caught the wing because you were using group autofocus on the Nikon D850, and it focused on the closest subject to the camera, which happened to be the wing and not the head. It's so frustrating because you just want to execute on that shot. And that's what the eye autofocus allows you to do. That's what improves the hit rate of your shots. That's why the camera is so valuable and why I've liked it so much, is because I know with reliability, I can find the subject, I can position myself in the right place, and then I can push the eye autofocus and it's going to find the eye and it's going to sharply focus on the eye. And that to me has been a really big difference in terms of execution of shots and the ease of use of the camera system in the field. So thumbs up for the eye autofocus. The other thing with the autofocus technology that I'm finding myself really liking about the R5 is tracking. Now the d850 had 3D tracking. It had the capability to track a subject through the sky, but it was kind of hit and miss. I didn't find it to be that reliable. Honestly, it wasn't that helpful to me. Instead, I ended up trying to capture focus with like dynamic 9 autofocus or group autofocus and try to physically pan the camera to try to track the subject as it moved. With the R5, it's exceptional. Now, this may go for other mirrorless systems as well. I'm not sure. It certainly goes for Sony. It might go for the Nikon mirrorless systems as well. But the tracking capability of these mirrorless systems is incredible. I mean, it'll find a subject, in this part of the screen, and you can track it as it moves through the whole frame without moving your camera. You don't have to pan to track the subject. It'll track the subject perfectly the entire time. And more often than not, I'm able to hit eye autofocus. One of the best examples of this is I was trying to capture a hummingbird in flight, and I was so thrilled that the eye autofocus and the tracking working in tandem was able to capture this hummingbird, this Anna's hummingbird in flight as it moved through the sky. This is the type of shot. Sure, I might have been able to execute on the d850, but it would have been even harder to execute. And I was so happy that the R5 was able to capture it. So just an example of what I like about that autofocus capability with the combination of tracking a subject and eye autofocus. Two things I differentiate, but both are real steps up for me when I go from the d850 to the R5. Another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is frames per second. Now, I think there's a lot of talk about just more and more frames per second. I mean, these cameras are getting to be basically video cameras, because with the Z9 you can shoot 120 frames per second if you're shooting JPEG. I mean, that's insane. It's like a stop motion film. But the difference between 6 frames per second and 12 frames per second obviously is double, but I do think that kind of initial part of the curve as you're going up, it actually does help a lot. So the D850 was 6 frames per second. The R5 can shoot 12 frames per second mechanical, and I found that to be much more useful when shooting wildlife. I'm able to capture the frames that I want. More often than not, most of those frames are in focus because of the autofocus capability, but I can get the right kind of perspective or the right positioning of the subject much more easily when you're shooting 12 frames per second. Now, I will note the R5 does shoot 20 frames per second if you shoot electronic, and that's cool. I thought I would use it, but I'm not actually using it that much. I don't want to deal with rolling shutter, which is an issue with the electronic shutter. And the other thing is I find 20 to be just excessive. 12 is much more than I need probably, or at least it's sufficient. And going through 12 frames per second of a subject means you end up with a lot of shots. So scrolling through all those photos can be a little bit cumbersome to find the one that you want. And it seems unnecessary to shoot more frames per second for me personally. So I've ended up shooting 12 frames mechanical, but it is a nice benefit and advantage when going from the D850 to the R5. I do want to talk about other things. So one thing is energy management. Now, the D850 is an amazing camera. I was able to shoot on one battery all day. I mean, more often than not, if I was shooting a Nikon original battery, I was able to shoot that battery for 1,000, 2,000 frames on that one battery. The R5, as a mirrorless system, is not as energy efficient. There's no question about it. I mean, just guesstimating here, I would say that maybe the batteries are lasting about half as long as they did on the D850. I'm sure there's a more empirical way to study that, but there's no question that you need multiple batteries every single time you go out just to make sure that you're okay. Now, it's not as bad as some would have expected. I personally expected to be in a situation where I would need batteries constantly. I've actually managed with only one battery for the last month and a half due to supply chain shortages. I haven't been able to get a second R5 battery. Now that means that I charge it every single night religiously. I make sure I have a full battery every time I go out, but generally it's been okay for like a 3 to 4 day or a 3 to 4 hour shoot. But that does mean you need to be a little bit more thoughtful about energy management. So I've had to kind of configure the settings on the camera to be as efficient as possible so that I can make this battery last for the entire day. But even here, you know, I'm shooting video and I'm probably going to get at least an hour worth of shooting on one battery, which I think is pretty good, maybe even more. One thing I really like about the R5 when it comes to energy management compared to D850 is you can just plug in a USB-C cord to your camera body without removing the battery and it will charge. And that is awesome. I have had so many times in the field or on trips where I've forgotten my battery charger for a stupid reason, or I haven't brought enough batteries with the D850. You're out of luck. And when you're in that situation, you have to either buy more batteries or buy a charger on Amazon, 2-day delivery, and just get it and shoot and recharge your batteries. But in this case, you can charge it with a battery bank. So there have been multiple occasions where I do have only a single battery in the field, but I bring a large capacity battery bank. I just plug in the USB-C into the side of the camera and I recharge the battery. And that is huge. I love it. It's wonderful for battery management, for energy management, and for travel with the camera. So that is a huge thing I've really enjoyed using in terms of ergonomic factor. Speaking of ergonomics, I do think the form factor of the two cameras has taken a little bit of getting used to. The R5 is smaller, it's lighter in the pack. That is a big thumbs up. It's been welcome and I've enjoyed it. The D850 feels more solid in your hand. It doesn't feel like a fragile piece of electronics. It feels like a durable, you know, beast, which it is. So I felt like the R5 feels a little bit more fragile in the hand. Now, I don't know, maybe that's just me with a new camera trying to take care of it, be that as it may, but it's smaller, it's a little more delicate. The screen is articulating, which is a wonderful thing. I'm actually able to use it right now while vlogging and able to look at the screen here. But it just feels like it could snap off. It feels a little bit more delicate to me. So I'm taking a little bit more care of it. I'm babying it a little bit more. Now it's dust, you know, proof, it's weather sealed. It's a wonderful camera. I'm sure it's actually quite durable, but from my perspective, compared to the D850, it feels a little bit more fragile. One thing I like about the R5 is it does have enough room for me to fit all 4 fingers on the grip of the camera, and that to me was really important. It's one of the reasons why I did not look at the smaller Sony systems, because it just frustrates me when you can't touch, when your pinky is kind of stranded and it's just hanging out there. Maybe I would have gotten used to it, maybe I wouldn't, I'm not really sure. But to me, the R5 was this nice kind of in-between option between the Sony and the Nikon D850 body that I was used to, where I could still kind of put my fingers on it and still kind of grab the meat of the camera and feel like I was holding something solid in my hand, but also not have to deal with having too small a camera that was going to be a problem. So I really like the ergonomics, the design, the size of it. It's taking up less space and it weighs a lot less, and that's kind of a welcome benefit. Now, one other thing that I've been a little uncertain about is whether or not the images out of the R5 are more noisy in terms of ISO noise than the D850 is. With the R5, I've shut off the noise reduction in the camera, so my images, my raw images are coming out pretty noisy. I've changed my workflow as a result. I run these now through DxO Pure Raw 2, I think is what it's called. This is an incredible program for removing noise, and I'll do a video on that later. So I'm getting images that are very usable that are 12,800 ISO images. Now, it may be that I'm pushing the camera harder than I did the D850. D850, I only went to 6,400 because it was too noisy. But it also may be that the images are more noisy. But I think the end result that I found is it doesn't really matter. The images I'm getting out of here are great images. They are sharp enough for me, even at 12,800. And so I've been generally impressed by the capabilities of the camera and the ability to photograph subjects in dark light. This has been a little bit of an issue only because the lenses available for the R5 are expensive and they tend to have smaller apertures, maximum apertures. So the lens I've been using for wildlife is the RF 100 to 500. It's an expensive lens at almost $3,000. You can get it for about $2,600 if you buy it refurbished. Like I also bought this camera refurbished, so you can save a little bit of money there. But it is a very expensive lens, and at 500 it's f7.1, so you end up with a little bit more noise in your images because you have to shoot a higher ISO, all things equal. This processing workflow, though, has addressed that for me personally, so I haven't experienced that to be too much of an issue. Hey, so two other points that I realized I didn't get to hit on when I was in the bird hide. I'm at a different location now. I actually just saw an American Kessel, which is really cool, and a belted kingfisher, which is also very cool. So anyway, the 2 points are one related to lenses, the other related to firmware. So I'm happy with the lenses that I have. The RF 24 to 105 and the 100 to 500 are very good lenses, and they perform very well. But they do highlight a point, which is that you kind of are forced to go with the Canon native RF mounts if you want to do an RF mount lens. Now you can use an adapter, and I actually tried this initially with the EF 400 5.6, and it worked great. It worked flawlessly. The adapter is basically just a piece of plastic that changes the mount on one end into the other. There's no glass, there's nothing to go wrong, and it works very well. In fact, people are reporting that their EF lenses, that is their Canon DSLR lenses, are actually working better on the R series cameras because they're leveraging the improved autofocus, and it's just basically making a EF lens better. But that is to say, there are no real alternatives to Canon glass if you want the RF mount. There are Samyang Rokinon lenses that are available. They've made some in the RF mount, but they've actually discontinued them because they were having trouble, I think, that's what they said, keeping up with the updates that were happening with the Canon system, the firmware updates, which are requiring constant firmware updates to the lenses, and it's just back and forth. So that creates this sort of situation where you're kind of forced to take the Canon lenses if you want an RF mount. And they're expensive, they perform very well, but it means you're kind of limited. So for example, in the Nikon, the d850, I had the Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary lens, phenomenal lens. I got a really good copy. It was really sharp. I was very happy with it. And that was the lens I used for wildlife. But here with the RF mount, I'm maxed out at 500 millimeters because that's the available one that I could afford with the Canon RF, the 100 to 500. So you don't really have the option at this point. Now, I think eventually maybe third-party lenses will become available for the RF mount, native RF third-party lenses, and that'll be a game changer because that will reduce the cost of Canon lenses probably because of competition. But as it stands right now, you're kind of stuck with Canon glass if you go with the Canon system. That's okay, but it is something that's worth recognizing. The other point I wanted to make is about firmware. Now, firmware updates can be good, right? Because they could essentially be examples of new technology or new capabilities that are being put on a camera. They can also be bad because they can mean that the camera initial firmware was not up to par with where we would expect it to be, and so firmware updates are needed in order to bring that along. And that's kind of a mix of what's happening with the Canon R systems right now. So there have been a handful of updates. Users are reporting some sort of lockup, particularly when you use back button focus. So there have been a series of updates like 1.4.5, 1.4.6, et cetera, all the way up to 1.5.2 right now. I've made these updates. I have not had many problems with the Canon software, the firmware on the camera. I have experienced one or two lockups, but I actually experienced some lockups back in the day with the d850 where you have to turn the camera off, pop out the battery, put it back in. But it really has happened maybe like 2 or 3 times, knock on wood, for me with the Canon system and with the Nikon system. But some people are reporting major issues with that. It may have to do with manufacturing flaws, things like that. It may be related to firmware. Nobody really seems to know. But there have been this constant slew of updates. Now, it's easy to make these updates, much easier than I found with the Nikon. On the other hand, I kind of wish that their updates weren't necessary and that they could just be pushing out a single update with that technology, and then any new firmware updates would be just new capabilities. It's kind of a mixed bag. It's new technology. You deal with that. But it is worth mentioning here is maybe a headache related to the Canon system, which is some of these kinks weren't really worked out before it went into production, and users are identifying it. On the flip side, Canon's dealing with most of those and putting out updates. So I'm not sure how you want to interpret it, but I do think it's worth sharing that information with you. So I wanted to give some final thoughts. Not a verdict, but some final thoughts. I'm really happy I made the transition. For me, just having the bird eye autofocus and the autofocus capabilities, it's really opened up a whole new set of doors, like an entire hallway of doors when it comes to wildlife photography. I find that I'm able to get sharper shots more often. I'm able to get birds in flight more easily. And I just like the camera. It's a nice system. Now, I used to shoot Canon, so I'm not really that biased in terms of Canon versus Nikon. I think there are a lot of people out there who take it personally if you push back on a brand that they shoot. I'm not really sure why we feel so much affinity for our brands. And I think we should all kind of try to remove that yoke to the best we can. I suspect that we feel guilty perhaps, or like we have an obligation to defend our purchasing decisions. These are extremely expensive systems, whether it's the D850 or the R5 and all the lenses you end up buying. And there's a tendency perhaps to defend our decisions and feel good about the choices we've made because we've invested so much money. But for me personally, this switch made a lot of sense. It's making wildlife a lot easier for me. I'm enjoying the ability to do vlogging and video a little bit more easily with the articulating screen. I'm really happy with the smaller form factor and the size. It's just a little bit lighter in my pack, but still comfortable. And so far, I've been really happy with the lens selection. I've ended up choosing the R5 24-105 f4 and the RF, and the RF 100 to 500 f4.5 to 7.1 for wildlife. And that combination of those two lenses has suited me pretty well. I've resisted the urge to buy a wide angle at this point, though I may look at the 14 to 35 f4. But that's what I got for you. Those are my first impressions. I think it's a great camera, and I found it to be really fun to shoot with the new system. I think the biggest step up is the autofocus capability of the lens compared to the camera system compared to the D850. And that begs the question, do you need to make the transition? Does it benefit you? And the answer is you do not need to make the transition. There's no real reason why you must transition from a D850 to anything. The D850 is an exceptional camera. But I do think that there are benefits to those who shoot moving subjects, or those who shoot wildlife, or perhaps portraiture, where you want to make sure you have the eye autofocus if you're shooting with a really wide aperture like a 1.2 or something like that, and every little bit of focus matters a lot. So that's kind of my takeaway. I'm planning to use this camera, for the next at least 5 years or so. And I'm pretty happy with the transition, and I look forward to many happy years of shooting ahead with the Canon mirrorless system.